But wait, you might be saying to yourself, this group is called the National Socialist German Workers' Party. It's got the word socialist in there, and it's got the word workers in there, and you're telling me that they were angry and upset and hated socialists and communists, and you say that they were a far right group? Well, yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. And that's something that you need to understand the distinction of. Now, I mentioned they were imitating the fascists of Italy, and in a few minutes, we'll talk about those guys, and I will explain in much more detail what fascism actually is. But fascism is a far right philosophy. Now, words can be misleading. For example, the Democratic Republic of Korea, alias North Korea, calls itself the Democratic Republic of Korea, but it is by no means democratic, and I'm not sure it even qualifies as a republic, but it still has those words in there. Well, think about it in the context of working class people like Hitler was, um, who liked to come together at the end of World War One. They were coming together and talking about, as working class people, how the country was being mistreated by the whole world and how humiliating it was, and it was all the fault of the Jews. So, in that sense, yes, they were workers. Um, Socialist in the sense that they didn't really like global capitalism because nationalists tend to be protectionist. And these particular nationalists believe that global capitalism was controlled by the Jews. But the word national comes in there first, and that really was the foremost part of their philosophy. And nationalism, extreme nationalism, if you take it all the way to the far right, in its ultimate expression, you have you have fascism. Just like if you go all the way to the left, all the way to the end of that spectrum, then you've got communism. Now, you may not recognize the guy on the left. That's Joseph Stalin, a longtime leader of the Soviet Union who was in charge during this period, and whom we'll be talking about a little bit later on, who was also a terrible, terrible person and a despot and essentially a dictator. Um, but that doesn't mean that ideologically these two guys are the same. Their methods were the same. Their ideologies were the complete opposite of one another. It's kind of like, well, I've heard it described as like a horseshoe. I like to think of it in terms of if any of you have ever played Pac-Man. When your little guy goes off the end of the screen, he pops back up on the other side. So that if you go all the way to the extreme radical end of either end of the spectrum, they start to look alike in application. So bear this in mind when we start talking more about Hitler's government and his policies. And the fact that right off the bat, one of the first groups that he went after were communists and socialists. And in the early 1920s, the National Socialist worker guys would frequently slug it out, literally, with groups of socialists in Germany. So don't let that confuse you. Well, after 1923, Hitler was safely locked away, working on his memoirs, and in the rest of Germany, the cultural situation in the 1920s, in some ways, kind of mirrored what was going on in the U.S., except the fact that in the U.S. in the 20s, the economy was booming, and in Germany, the economy had been boomed, basically. Um, the country and individuals within the country were having to rely more and more on loans from American banks. Now, if you'll think about that for a second and what we've already discussed about how the 1920s ended, if you've got a country that's not in great shape to start with and they're really deeply tied to the American banking system in 1929, you can imagine what happens. It got a whole lot worse then. But even in the 1920s, money, as I said, was being greatly devalued, and people in general had sort of, this is how it mirrored the U.S. in the 20s, had kind of that jazz age, roaring 20s approach, and for the same reason, for the same reasons, a distraction from the difficulty of life and the disenchantment. I mean, if we talked about the lost generation, U.S. soldiers being disenchanted with the war, imagine how it would be if they had also lost the war. In fact, there was this party attitude. A lot of people were out spending their money, what little they had, when they had it at bars and stuff, because, however much money you've got today, tomorrow may be worth half as much, and the next day half as much as that. So you better spend it now while it'll buy something. So that was going on. There was a big party atmosphere. There was also a big artistic renaissance going on. The proliferation of cabaret places, physical material arts, architecture, painting, music, filmmaking. Some of the best films being made in the 1920s were being made in Germany. Also, a lot of emphasis on modernizing, getting in sync with the rest of the world in the 20th century. And a lot of the young people were emulating the style of dress and the behavior that they were seeing in films from Hollywood, which ticked off a lot of people who weren't in on the fun. Kind of like the same thing that was happening, again, in the U.S., right? So you've got leftist intellectuals, socialists, and so forth, who look at all this partying going on and condemn it as reckless, irresponsible, and childish. Why those people should be organizing a strike or something. And then people on the far right look at all this partying that's going on, and they're thinking, well, this is just a total disintegration of traditional morals. They should be out saluting a flag or having a parade for the country or something like that. So kind of like the Weimar government. Young people and the artistic scene were starting to catch it from both ends. And, well, this party's not going to last. After he was released from prison, Hitler promised the government that he would henceforth only seek power through democratic means. And he set about working on doing that. And the Nazi Party set about gaining more support. But at first it wasn't easy because it's the late 1920s and things have started to level off a little bit with the economic situation in Germany. But then 1929 happens and the stock market collapses in the U.S. and global depression is now a thing, and that puts people in a much better frame of mind in Germany to listen to someone who has somebody to blame it on and who has promises of how he can not only fix it but restore the country to greatness, to make it once again great as it was when it was an empire. And Nazis started to get elected in public office. In the 1930 election, the Nazi Party got about 18% of the vote, which doesn't sound like much, but there were so many different parties and everything was so fragmented that 18% made them the second largest party in Parliament, which gave them quite a bit of leverage. 1932, at the same time that FDR was running against Hoover for President of the United States, Hitler ran for president against the establishment figure Paul von Hindenburg, and Hitler lost, but he had a sizable percentage of the vote, and he impressed some of the powers that be, some of the upper echelon political and business leaders in Germany, who thought that perhaps he might have a future, and actually they thought that perhaps his method of stirring people up and getting support might be helpful for them. They believed that he would be, well, they kind of didn't take him all that seriously. They thought he'd be easy to control. So they asked the newly installed President von Hindenburg to give Hitler a high up job, the job of chancellor, which essentially is a leadership position that's outside of Parliament. And Hindenburg did that, and so Hitler is now in the government. He also had one of his Nazi guys installed as the Secretary of the Interior. So as Chancellor, with an ally in the Secretary of the Interior, that meant that Hitler was in charge of the police. Well, there were still no one still had enough seats in Parliament to control the whole thing. So they're trying to constitute a government. That's how parliaments work. They have to work together with the different parties to form coalitions. And in the midst of trying to do that, a fire broke out in Berlin. And the fire was blamed on communists, and a communist was arrested. Opinions are divided as to whether the communist guy had set the fire out of anger or whatever, protest, or whether it was one of Hitler's guys that set the fire so they could blame it on the communists. Either way, once this fire happened, this is a pretty big fire, Hitler convinced President Hindenburg to enact a new law that enabled the German government to essentially declare martial law because there was a state of emergency. Communists are burning down the country. So he was given the authority to do that. Later on, there was this thing called the Enabling Act that passed through Parliament that gave the Chancellor authority basically to have almost unlimited power during an emergency until the emergency passed. Now, this had to pass in the German Parliament by a 2/3 majority, and that was easily arranged because Hitler just had all the socialist and communist members of Parliament arrested, so they couldn't show up to vote. And he won the vote and got the power temporarily. The thing is, when you get temporary ultimate power until an emergency passes, and you're the guy that decides when the emergency has passed, the emergency is never going to pass, and you're going to keep that power. So those of you who sat through the Star Wars prequels and saw the rise of Palpatine from senator to emperor, saw that reenacted in much the same way, and declaring an artificial emergency and using that as an excuse to assume great power temporarily, with air quotes. Well, once he was actually in charge, Hindenburg was kind of an afterthought after that. The country under Hitler started rearming. All those things they'd promised not to do. They were not allowed, not only submarines were they not allowed to have, they weren't allowed to have tanks or heavy artillery, and they started making them. And all of that defense spending, making all of these new weapons, well, that creates jobs. And so the military spending that Hitler ramped up actually did improve the German economy because it put people to work. So if that's the only thing that you were concerned about, whether the economy was working well, well, then you'd have loved Hitler if you were in Germany. But if you cared about absolutely anything else, you would have had a completely different view.